So this presentation leads with a bit of an interactive activity. The purple and green index cards on the tables will be relevant for this, and if you don't have enough at your table, I think there are more over by the books, or actually they're over here, so if anyone needs a set, I can pass them around. Yes. Yeah, you feel free to sit there. This panel is partly driven by thinking about a very common trope of speculative fiction and applications of it in both industry and elsewhere, which is the construction of scenarios and sort of the plotting out of specific ways that the future will go towards specific ends, which can often become sort of self-fulfilling prophecies or be based on trying to turn uncertainty into very specific odds. We have a really wonderful group of people to speak, and I'm going to introduce people before they speak, but I'm going to do the short version of their bios because you have the long versions all sitting on those tables. And we are starting with Rose Eveleth, who is a producer, reporter, writer, and host based in Berkeley, California, who explores how humans tangle with science and technology. And she is the creator and host of the podcast Flash Forward, a show about possible and not so possible futures. And we are very lucky to have her. So thank you very much.
I'm good, yeah. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm going to stand like this. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. So what we're going to do is a choose your own path game, not choose your own adventure, because they will send me a cease and desist letter if I use that phrase. It's trademarked. I have, in fact, gotten a cease and desist letter from them before. So let's all use the term choose your own path. So you're going to have, you have these two cards. Does everyone have the cards? This is important. Yes, this is going to be fun. So what's going to happen is I'm going to read to you from this story here in this beautiful book that Ingrid helped make, which I love. And you are going to get to pick what happens. I've done a thing like this before for huge audiences of people who don't think about the future, but I'm actually slightly more nervous to do it for a smaller audience who does think about the future a lot, because what the book tries to do and what these sort of choose your own path scenarios try to do is force people to think about the future. You all don't really need to be forced to think about the future, because I think you do it all the time. But a lot of people who come to these events, I've done them live in all across the country, don't engage in this kind of thinking very often. And so this format sort of forces you to be the main character in a way that other sort of maybe versions of doing this you can kind of be a little bit more removed. So I'm going to read to you. I'm going to read a story to you. And we'll do one run through, but obviously if you want to see what else happens, you can get one of these lovely books. Okay. Just a little bit of background. This is obviously speculative fiction, but pretty much everything in here is based on, so I'm a journalist mostly, and everything in here is based on interviews with companies that are working on these actual technologies and sort of these possible things. So none of the technology in here is invented. It all either exists on the market now or is going to come onto the market in the next 6 months or so if they've told me accurate timelines, which I'm not going to stick my neck out for any of those companies and say that they're correct on when they'll have things delivered. So just to give a little bit of background, here in the US, there are 6 million people over the age of 85. Experts estimate that by 2050, there will be 19 million people over the age of 85. This rise in sort of a senior population has been called all sorts of things. My favorite is the gray dawn, which is apparently what people like to call it. And if anyone has dealt with this, caring for loved ones or people in your family who are older can be really difficult. Often, especially in a country like the United States where people are spread out, it can be hard to give care, maintain care, and obviously very expensive. The average cost of a year in a nursing home is over $80,000 in the US. In-home services, if you want to have your loved one or have someone stay at home, is $48,000. This is not cheap. And at the same time, lots of care facilities are actually reporting that people are leaving those jobs because they pay really poorly, and they're very difficult and stressful, and there's not a lot of support systems for those workers. Often they're on contract, they don't have good insurance themselves, it's sort of complicated. So a lot of, as with many things now, a lot of technology groups are looking at potential ways to have tech help. And we're gonna hear about some of that. Okay, I'm gonna get into it. I'm like way more nervous to talk to you all than I ever am. This is embarrassing. Okay. It's finally the day. You knew it was coming, of course, but it still feels weird. Today, you are taking your father to his new home, an assisted living facility. It's cool outside, and the sky is a flat blue. You get in your car, and you pull up directions to Vanguard Estates. You don't really know where the place is. Your sister, Imani, did all of the research and reported back to you. State of the art, not that far away, expensive, but not as expensive as most options. A steal, really. Clean, safe, all the words you wanted to hear. So you get in your car and you drive. As promised, Vanguard Estates is only 45 minutes away. It's styled like an old East Coast country club with white wood shingles and a big, welcoming French door. In the lobby, you meet your dad. "Hello, how was the drive?" he asks. "And your sister." "You're late, as usual," she reminds you. She leads the way down a long hall towards your dad's unit. Every few steps, you pass another resident's door, and you can't help but look in. The units are spacious, with big windows. Inside, you see a variety of older people just going about their days, reading, cooking, watching TV. And yet, you feel like something is weird. Near the end of the hall, you come to your dad's apartment. There's a sign on the door that says, "Welcome, Marcus." Inside, there's a small living room filled with a mixture of his furniture and some that must have come from the facility, yet it all seems to match perfectly, kind of a retired art professor vibe. To the left, there's a kitchen outfitted with a small stove, a dishwasher, a big fridge. The fridge is also a giant touchscreen. Your sister is showing your dad how it works. Here's a calendar for your day. Here's how to keep track of your medicine. Here's a button you can press if you need someone to help you. That's when it hits you. The thing that's weird. You haven't seen anybody actually working here. Nobody in polo shirts or with a name tag. No security. No nurses. Then there's a chime at the door. "Hello, Mr. Jones. How can I be of service?" You turn and you come face to face with a screen. A screen on a tall stick on wheels. A robot. Through the open door, you see another screen on a stick roll down the hall. You turn to your sister. "You did not tell me there would be robots." Your sister laughs. "Did you read the information I sent you about this place?" "Of course I did," you shoot back. "You're lying. You absolutely did not. But surely it can't all be robots. Are there any humans in this place at all, you ask?" There's one human on call 24/7, but they live and work in a house down the road. Everything else is left to the bots. You turn to your dad. Surely he did not know this either. He just shrugs. "You two sort this out. I do not want to be involved." Now that you think about it, you do remember some weird language in the stuff that you skimmed. Big data, algorithmic care, but it was all kind of meaningless to you. You didn't realize it meant robots. Is this a good idea? Will your dad be left to be manipulated by crazed machines? You are the older sibling. You know you can throw a fit and pull the plug on this whole thing right now. The robot and your sister are standing there, waiting. This is the part where you get to decide. Do you? Purple card. Decide to leave him there. You and your sister arrange this whole thing. You've already put down a deposit. Maybe it will be fine. Or do you green card, put your foot down and say, "Absolutely not. This is not happening." This is the part where I very scientifically look and see who wins, and we progress from there. Okay, so purple is leave him there, green is take him home.
Does he have any opinions? Yeah.
We don't know that yet. That is addressed soon. Oh man, it's like 50-50. Okay, I think purple is winning right now. I think we leave him there for now. He said he wanted us to them to sort it out. So let's see, where are we? Purple, page 8. You realize that you have no backup plan. All your dad's stuff is here, and the last time he lived with you, it did not go well for either of you. You sigh in defeat. Your sister smirks and turns to the robot. "We're all set, thank you." "My pleasure, Imani. Ring any time you need anything." Great. It knows her name. It probably knows your name too, but you don't want to test it to find out. You leave your dad on the couch where he's reading a book about the latest JFK assassination conspiracy theories. When you get home, you fish the flyers you grabbed from the facility out of your bag and sit down in front of the computer. You should probably figure out exactly what you just agreed to. On the homepage for Vanguard Estates, there are 2 big buttons: family, residence. You click Family, and a screen pops up asking you to put in some information about yourself. Your name, your father's name, his room number, a family passcode. Once you're logged in, you can see a big, smiling photo of your dad and some basic profile information. On the right side, a button catches your eye. It says, Drop In. You click, and up pops an image of your dad's apartment. He's on the couch, asleep with his stupid JFK book resting open on his chest. It takes you a second to realize that you're watching a live feed from a camera somewhere in the ceiling. You quickly close out the window. That's spying, isn't it? You read the fine print below the button. Drop-in is automatically enabled on all rooms. To disable drop-in mode, click here. It seems creepy to be able to spy on your dad anytime without him knowing. Then again, you did just leave him in the care of robots, so maybe it's a good idea to keep an eye on things. So what do? Do you, purple card, decide that a little bit of checking in is fine, you're not spying on him, you're spying on the robots? Or do you, green, decide to disable the drop-in feature? You don't want to spy on him. It's so interesting compared to like what normal people would say. I love you all. Okay, I think green, I think we are not spying. We are not spying. I'm shocked that you all don't want to spy. You click disable. You can only imagine what your dad would think if he found out that his kids were spying on him. You go back to the main page where you can toggle through a growing list of information. Some of it is basic medical stuff, height, weight, medications. Other stuff is more detailed. There's a running heart rate and blood pressure meter, which means they've outfitted him with some kind of wearable device. You can see steps ticking up. He must be walking around right now. There's a tab for nutrition, calories consumed, time of day, type of food. There's also a tab called social, where over the next few weeks, you watch your dad's calendar slowly fill up. Book clubs, movie nights, lunches with new friends. You can even read a transcript of each conversation and a detailed breakdown of how many words he said, the complexity of those words, and how balanced the conversation was. One afternoon, he got into an argument with a robot about whether it was playing the version of the Nirvana song that he asked for. Then there was the time he tried to flirt with another resident. Did not go well. You try not to read these transcripts too often, but it's hard to resist. They give a picture of your dad that you've never seen before, the way he talks to people when you're not around. Then, one morning, after 9 months at Vanguard Estates, your phone starts to buzz in a way that you've never felt before. 3 long buzzes and 1 short one. The home screen is filled with a big red box. He fell. You quickly call Vanguard and get the details. He slipped while getting out of the shower. Robotechs were on the scene immediately and got him to the hospital in under 20 minutes. You call your sister, and you both head over. When you get to the hospital, your dad is confused. He's not quite sure where he is or why. In the hallway, you're met by a tall woman in a polo shirt with the Vanguard Estates logo on it. This is the first human you've met who works for them. You make a joke about how perhaps she's secretly just a really fancy robot. She does not laugh. The hospital does not allow our bots inside, so it is my job to liaison between the residents and the facility. Then she explains why she's really there. Once a resident has a fall, the services in their portfolio change. The check-in bots that you've met will come by more frequently. Residents who've entered into the high-risk category for falling also cannot bathe alone. They can be assisted by a robot or a human aide. The robot assistant is included in your package. The human would be an additional monthly fee of $1,200. You want to ask your dad what he wants, but he's not exactly lucid, and apparently you have to decide now. So you have to choose. Opt for robotic baths or shell out extra money for human ones. So do you purple, go for the robot bath? Green, decide it's worth it to pay extra for the human one. You're more split on this one than I expected. I think we're purple. I think we go for the robots. You can see all the other storylines in the book. Don't yell at me. Sometimes I do this and people start fighting with each other, like their date that they brought, and they're like yelling at each other. I'm like, we have to move on. Page 28. The bath bots don't even really look like robots to you. They're more like turning your bathroom into a car wash for people. 2 giant arms installed into the walls equipped with cameras and sensors. You and your sister both sign the various privacy waivers involved. Your eyes glaze over reading the terms and conditions. Data collected and stored in a profile and something, anonymized something. You accept. You explain the bots to your dad over the phone. He shouldn't be alarmed, they're very safe. Plus, wouldn't it be weird to have a stranger giving you a bath? Robots are less awkward. He's skeptical at first, but eventually comes around. Apparently, the bot has learned the exact order in which he likes to wash, which delights him. Nearly a year later, you're lying in your bed, squinting at your phone, half awake. The newsfeed is both dire and dull. Everything feels awful, but also the same. Then a headline catches your eye. Senior care bath robots hacked. Millions of hours of videos posted online. You sit up in bed. The company that manufactures bath bots for senior care facilities all over the country was targeted by hackers who downloaded patient footage and posted it online. Vanguard Estates is on the list of compromised facilities. You find the link to the page where the footage is posted. There's a pit deep in your stomach as you click. It's a wall of wrinkly, naked screenshots. You're relieved to see that no names or patient numbers are attached. Nobody would recognize these people unless they really knew them. You also realize that the only way to find out if your dad is on here is to scrutinize every one of these thousands and thousands of videos. Your dad will probably never see this page. In fact, he'll probably never see this news. The facility has tight filters on the news that residents get, and they certainly will remove this from their feeds. There's no way he would know if you didn't say something. When you video chat later that day, he can tell that you're being kind of weird. What's wrong, he asks. Should you tell him? You don't even know if he's on this page or not, and you're not sure how he'll take it. You consider whether you would want to know if it was you. So, do you purple, decide to tell him about the hack? Or do you green, keep it to yourself? There's no point stressing him out about something that he can't do anything about. Oh man, this is hard. I think we're green. I think we keep it to ourselves. Go to page 56. You chose this, it's not my fault. 56. Okay. You don't tell him. What good would it do? You don't even know if his footage is up there anyway. After your call, the transcript is added to his file under the Family Contact tab. There's a green smiley face next to it, indicating that the algorithms have determined that the conversation was a positive one. Resident happiness is directly correlated with positive family contact, the page cheerily reminds you. Apparently, the bots have not quite figured out how to tell when that family contact is lying. The end. Thank you. So you can read the other endings in here. I'm curious to know what people think, so come find me after, and I want to talk about this kind of future storytelling, because it's very fun to make up stories.
Rose, thank you so much. Our next speaker in this lineup is Dan Bouk. Is that the right way to pronounce it? Bouk is right. Okay, got it. Really? Okay. Now I don't feel quite. Okay, so Dan Bouk researches the history of bureaucracies, quantification, and other modern things shrouded in cloaks of boringness. He is the author of How Our Days Became Numbered, Risk and the Rise of the Statistical Individual, and is an associate professor of history at Colgate University, and you can read more of his longer bio if you so choose. All right, and we have...
All right, so thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Rigo. Thank you, Data and Society, and all the other folks who are making this all possible. I'm a historian. I don't think about the future very much, so thank you, Rose. Today, my talk is ultimately about historical predictions of human futures. I'm also a historian, so I read things, which is what we do. Sorry, it's just the way it is. So in particular about the life course of workers. So future predictions about the life course of workers. But first, it's also a story about science and technical practices, like making graphs. I'm going to be showing you archival graphs today, and how they can make economic structures and corporate strategies look natural. So first, I need to talk to you about how futures forecast for machines and things, exciting things like water pumps, telephone poles, electric lamps, how those kinds of objects came to have lifespans just like humans, what came to be called service lives. So that's moving from human to the machine. Then the second part of the talk, we go the other direction. We see how practices for predicting service lives of capital goods were turned back on labor. I'll explain how the idea of the service life turned back on people whose lives of service could last as long as the company said that it would. So kind of like Rose's narrative here, I'm also thinking through the relationships across the human-machine boundary, but in the past. All right, humans to machines. So the story begins at the turn of the 20th century, in the midst of a battle to exert state control over a new breed of heavily capitalized, often monopolistic corporations. Not Google, not Apple, think instead railroads, telegraph and telephone companies, and big municipal utilities, the waterworks, the electric company, streetcar operators. The invention of the service life came as the nation's more conservative courts turned against more aggressive forms of regulation. They settled instead on a rule. Towns, cities, counties, states, whoever was going to do the regulation could set the rates charged by these regulated monopolies, by these big corporations. But a company could challenge those rates in courts, particularly if they said that the rates were so low that it prevented them from getting a reasonable return on their investment, which was taken to be about 4 to 6%. That looks different. That's okay. This basically, the reason I have this up here is just, if you want to think what the company's thinking, they want to prove that their return on investment for the courts is lower probably than it actually is, because they want to prove that they're being charged they want to charge more. They always want to charge more. So the profit there is going to be basically fixed. So they want this denominator, cost of reproduction minus depreciation, to be as big as possible, which means they want depreciation, that charge, to be as small as possible for this calculation. In other calculations, in other courts, they totally try to make the depreciation higher because it's useful for that calculation. So, I mean, accounting is rhetoric at a very important level. So, engineers charged with making depreciation calculations for a massive company's entire capital stock began turning to charts like these. It has age in years on the bottom. It has the percent of boilers, in this case, for a waterworks, how long they survive. In this case, the longest one lasts to be about 24 years old. Here's a similar chart for wooden telegraph poles. This is incandescent lamps. Here we've got cast iron wheels and pumping engines for the city of Chicago. What's the common factor in all of these, other than the fact that they all look kind of the same, have a similar shape? They all have to do with materials, capital goods that are necessary and important to regulated monopolies. All right, that's the exciting stuff. The authors of these charts emulated human mortality curves, right? They look exactly the same. It's the same kind of process by which they're doing it. And they did it in part because life tables had already proven themselves practical. As one of these people said, human mortality tables are already undergirding numerous colossal life insurance businesses in the world. If it's good enough for life insurance, why can't it be good enough for our waterworks, for our pumps, the pumps we care about? All right, so these graphs, these kinds of tables, were, and they remained for quite a long time, purely regulatory goods, which is to say, or tools. Engineers at the time were very clear that they weren't using these in their kind of daily life. So like one engineer in 1913, he says, it's not like my colleagues are, we turn to our pigeonhole and pull out a average of the life of railroad physical property table and reason, the table shows that this item of physical property has been in use for so many years. Therefore, it must be replaced. No, they observe their plants. He goes on to say that they know their physical property intimately, and when something was broken, they fixed it. When it wasn't, they left it there. So this was a regulatory tool. Still, many engineers cheered the fact that these tools existed. Smart regulation struck them as better than nationalization, which is what they thought was the other kind of alternative. And smart regulation was a constraint on their bosses, who were often tempted to, and in fact did, pay dividends out of capital, which is to say, hold off on maintenance to increase the amount of dividends they'd be paying regularly. So for the engineers, the court's decision, guided by these rational tables, essentially guaranteed a profit for these corporations while freeing engineers to care for their machines and build companies that they hoped, that they imagined were going to last forever. Now you may be thinking, machines aren't alive. This did not escape the notice of the engineers. Thanks. I got to build in time for that laugh line. Things would break, but more often, engineers stuffed their machines, their plants, their telephone poles served at the pleasure of the corporation. So a machine often died because the company deemed it obsolete or inadequate. Property might appear perfectly functional. It could be perfectly functional, and yet be worthless to a railroad or a utility. So imagine for a moment that you own a fleet of streetcars. You with me? Yeah? All right, so your fleet are all cars in which you enter from the back. You get into the back and you sit down. But then, suddenly, this is a real quote, soon enough, the too critical public, often voiced through demagogues, renders all back entrance cars obsolete. You're getting into the side. Demagogues. It's the demagogues and those back against the back entrance cars for the side entrance cars. Or, so that's called obsolescence. That's the problem of obsolescence. Alternately, you build a plant for like all the amount of stuff you're doing, and it's great, but then you're doing it really well, and the demand suddenly skyrockets, and you just can't meet it. So now your plant is inadequate. You gotta get rid of it, build something new in order to meet this new demand. All right, so obsolescence and inadequacy. Critics at first said, well, sure, maybe these tables can handle things wearing out, but they can't handle obsolescence and inadequacy, right? Surely they cannot predict the pace of social and technological change. Or can they? So the telephone companies began saying as late in the late 1910s and through the 1930s that the advantage, the reason you wanted to think about these tables was precisely because they could, because they already had in their data a kind of estimate of the rate of technological change, of social change. And that was something that no matter how intimate your knowledge of your physical property was, you can't see that. So AT&T looked at these mortality tables and they saw a way to quantify the rate of technological change. The idea of using life tables on machines reached its apex in Iowa, at the state universities and experiment stations, which are, you might be surprised to learn, hotbeds of statistical innovation. It's actually not that surprising if you realize the way in which probability theory took root in agriculture. Thank you. So it's in Iowa that the service life was born. All right, the Iowa statisticians noticed that survivor curves for machines looked different than survivor curves for human mortality. One of the big differences that points out is this like startlingly horrible drop right here in human mortality, which is infant mortality rates, which are like particularly high in the early 20th century. They had been higher earlier, but still devastatingly high, and a source of an awful lot of contention. So eugenicists, this is a moment in which there are a lot of eugenicists, saw evidence of inferior heredity that needed to be improved by breeding. What were called at the time environmentalists saw evidence of the physical toll of poverty and unclean conditions on ordinary families. And often white children's advocates or male doctors saw evidence of poor mothering or the missteps of female midwives. An accusation was leveled with particular force against African Americans. Now, compared to infant mortality, the problem of predicting like the rate of technological change was easy. All right, so to the point the engineers felt like their thing was particularly difficult. In fact, what the Iowa engineers say is it's a lot easier to model machine lives and make it fit a smooth curve than it is to model a human life. Human mortality doesn't fit the numbers nearly so well. The Iowa statisticians created 18, but they discovered there's also more than one type of living machine. One way that machines live. Did they die? Whatever. So they created 18 types of mortality curves. This is a sample of those. This is 9 of them, the left modal variety of these, that could fit different kinds of capital goods. They abandoned talk of mortality because, quote, mortality suggests human beings and not inanimate objects, hence service life as the new term. The metaphor of human mortality and actuarial practices had each been transformed into tools that corporations could use to think about the future of their property and made those futures look like they were governed by natural laws. All right, so from human to machine, invention of the service life was a Gilded Age story, fight to regulate big capital. Now from machine back to human is a story about the developments with even bigger capital. The great merger movement at the turn of the 20th century created corporations of truly unprecedented size and scale. So a great example is AT&T, created by JP Morgan, that brought together the regional telephone monopolies. For Morgan and investors, the whole purpose of this thing was to create something which would deliver year in and year out reliable dividends. Company officials relied on sophisticated statistical analyses and a lot of debt to make that happen. And then came World War I, which did many things, but one thing in this case that it does is it caused corporate income taxes to jump quite a bit, and thus created new corporate tax deductions to match. Specifically, the federal government made pension plans for employees tax deductible, and, surprise, AT&T created a pension plan for employees that would be vested after 20 years. So if you kept with the company for 20 years, you could get a pension from AT&T. That was also when AT&T's statistical division started using the service life concept to think about its workers. So it began gathering records on all employees to construct tables of probable service periods. When in 1927 the feds went on and said, all right, we'll give you another deduction if you make your tables actuarially sound. Basically, if you actually figure out how long people are going to stay with the company and how long they'll live, and you fund it, you keep money out, then you get a bigger tax deduction. And AT&T did that too. And they could, in part because they had already been gathering all this data about their employees for long enough that they had a basis for making those calculations. I think for similar reasons, an engineer, or rather a statistician at Western Electric, decided to make these tables about employees. Let me zoom in. So this is male salaried against male wage, hourly wage workers. They are the same size, but they're on different scales. So this is a very steep curve for male salary that ends just a little bit below $100 a week, which is actually really darn good. And then male hourly is plateauing here around $38 a week or so. So that says there's class differences. Male salaried against female salaried, again, they look very similar, but in fact, the female salaried is stopping at $37 per week as against $93 a week, right? There's a giant difference here. And then it's even more striking if you compare male hourly against female hourly wage. This is basically a flat line if you use a reasonable scale, something like this from about 15 to 25. I mean, there's some, for women, there's some jump, but it's basically this is a dead-end job is what you would reasonably call it. And it was in some important ways. So AT&T's service life tables, to begin with, were like neither machine nor human life tables. They exhibited something like an absurdly amplified infant mortality, which is to say that 65% of people hired by AT&T were gone in 5 years. That's so a pretty normal turnover for the early 20th century, but still very, very high. And so for those who were usually managers or executives who survived that 20-year vesting period, they were lucky, but then their end of work came very suddenly, unlike most deaths where there's a distribution. You hit that 30 or 40 years of your career and bam, it's over. It's worth pausing here to note, AT&T applied the service idea as a part of the process of imagining that employees would stick around for a long time. Right? The point of offering pensions was actually to reduce turnover, to keep people in the corporation, imagining they'd work for a longer period of time. If the idea of the service life came with efforts to keep workers around, it also carried the possibility, though, of obsolescence. In 1929, Kodak created its own fund and pension plan, and a key executive explained that the plan's primary purpose was to both inspire loyalty and then to, quote, retire workers after they have passed their period of usefulness and replace them with more efficient workers. The pension system allowed the company to declare older workers obsolete. Influential thinkers of the time talked about writing down the value of depreciation of men as they aged. One such thinker, who was a life insurance expert, all right, so bringing us full circle, brought the conversation full circle, writing that each worker, quote, like the machine in industry has a fairly definite working life, and each year of activity produces a certain amount of depreciation. So in the mid-20th century, the service life of a worker who stuck with a company for 25 to 40 years started to get there's a new word for it, which called it a career. The word career had other purposes, but that's what it becomes to be known for. Pensions proliferated, especially after World War II, and what was called the Treaty of Detroit, by which organized auto workers agreed to give up a certain amount of control of the work floor, of their working conditions, in exchange for high wages and very generous pensions, especially generous pensions. As a result, many more individuals became capital goods, entitled to long service lives, but not all, of course, and it was still a significant privilege to be granted a service life. Here's what I mean. Unions were often segregated by race. Men often climbed career ladders built on the assumption that women would be employed to do dead-end clerical work. and men were often paid more because of the idea that they were supporting heterosexual households. At the same time, whole groups of workers could be declared obsolete, like the Mexican migrants who were hired by big agriculture through the Bracero program beginning in 1942 until the program ended suddenly in 1964. Managers, engineers, accountants, and human relations officers employed the service life concept and the career to predict futures and to make those futures, the future of a career, happen. They made it happen. But they much less frequently imagined those futures were possible for women, people of color, queer people, or migrants. All right, this is getting to the end. The sorts of tables that I've shown you today might look fairly cut and dry, indeed straight boring, but those who made them and used them often invested them a great deal of significance, an awful lot considering often how little data was actually behind them. Tables appeared to bring reason and rationality to the management of immortal corporations, and they imposed order, a natural order, on the lives of things and people that the corporation needed to operate. So in that sense, the stories that I've been telling you today are part of a larger history of how industry and the rise of corporations have made and remade our sense of time. So first in the 17th and 18th centuries came the imposition of clock time, displacing seasonal or agricultural rhythms. There's a big historical literature on this, but I think this is the most effective way to understand what it is that we're talking about. This is Sam the Sheepdog and Ralph the Wolf. Next came the expansion of railroads, the idea with railroad time, which got rid of the local noon that was governed by the sun. And then you've probably heard of these kind of changes. You've probably heard of other kinds of changes in terms of the way corporate efforts help to change our life course. For instance, turning youth into a marketing category in the middle of the 20th century. And so I'm saying that by creating the service life and applying it to workers and to themselves, engineers, accountants, and managers fixed the temporal outlines of what came to be the career, then the inside of which would be the subject of a great deal of debate and contention over the next 50 years. Now, when we look around and we talk about the disappearance of that 30-year or 40-year career in a single company, which, as I'm saying, was never a simple good, there's lots of literature against it, and was never equitably allocated. But as we talk about how that is going away, it's tempting to just say, man, these corporations and their scheduling algorithms and their quarterly earnings statements are getting rid of the natural form of employment, the natural shape of a life, even. My point has been not that those changes are very important that we're witnessing. We should pay an awful lot of attention to them and what happens to them. But the idea that corporations shape their career span, shape our lifespans, is not new. What's new is how they're doing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Our final speaker for this session is Tamara K. Nopper. Tamara has a PhD in sociology, and her teaching and research focuses on the intersection of economic, racial, and gender inequality with a particular emphasis on entrepreneurship, banking, immigrant sorry, I just skipped a line, globalization, urban development, and money and surveillance. Did you want any more of that, Red, or is that good?
Oh, no, good. Thanks.
Cool, yeah.
If you could just hold the mic closer to you. This is a note for all future speakers. If you could just hold the mic close to you so that our live stream audience can hear you better. Because if you hold it this way, we lose you. So.
Actually, do you mind if I actually
Sure.
really hold it? Okay, cool. Thank you. And then I just how's everybody doing? Good. So my name is Tamara. First, I want to thank Ingrid, Beth, Rigo, CJ, and all the volunteers who helped make this possible. And also thank you to all of you for showing up today. So I just want to warn you a few things. One is, I know I have a bad title. I'm terrible at titles. I sat there and looked at the screen for a while, and finally I was like, just write something and send it out, right? So, and then also we were given some pretty good directions around our imagery, and I have to say, where's Dan? Oh, I really liked your images, right? So I have to warn you, my images, a lot of them are screenshots of websites, and I know this. I just want you all to know that. Okay, so alternative data, credit scoring, and financial freedom. So people know who Jay-Z is, I'm assuming, right? And so he put out this very provocative music video called The Story of OJ. And one of the things that I was very struck by is, he asked this question, and he says, you want to know what's more important than wasting money at the strip club, right? And that's a very specific question, by the way, right? And it's one that we could actually sit and pause with, but for the purpose of this, we'll move on to see what his answer was. And his answer was credit, right? And who's seen the video? Okay, so a few of you, right? It is available on YouTube and on the internet. Okay, and so literally, this is me here, the answer. But when he says credit, the way he says it, it's like almost a thud. He's like credit, right? And the music video and the song is a lot about him kind of thinking through racial politics, race identity, and money. Right, and him thinking through kind of investments he's made, where he's at today, and so forth. And so one of the things that, as Ingrid talked about in the introduction, I'm deeply concerned about non-white people and the racial wealth gap and the issue of money and the level of stress that people are experiencing in terms of money. And so this question around kind of financial freedom, right? So there's a line in his song where he says, financial freedom is my only hope, right? Financial freedom, my only hope. And this kind of question about, well, what does financial freedom actually look like, right? In terms of racial justice, in terms of just kind of our day-to-day lives. So that's something that I'm preoccupied with. As Ingrid also mentioned, I'm preoccupied with this question about surveillance. So I'm thinking a lot about kind of the traps of money, and also how money and policing and surveillance connect, right? So I teach in a justice studies program that's connected to the sociology program at Rhode Island College, and I'm developing a course for a future semester on money, crime, and punishment, and just thinking a lot about like what are the nitty-gritty ways that money and policing and punishment kind of combine. So this is part of that bigger kind of project, and it might not be so obvious, but we're going to talk about that a little bit at the end. All right. So one of the things is, there was a lot of debate on social media, as there usually always is, about kind of certain music videos. And so there was a lot of debate about kind of Jay-Z's commentary about money. And I was interested in the conversation about credit because at the time I was working on a chapter for Ruha Benjamin's book, Captivating Technology, which will be out in 2019 on Duke University Press, right? I figured I'd plug it, right? Okay. And in that book, people are thinking about the issue around kind of policing, freedom, and technology. And so I was writing about alternative data and about fintech lenders, people who are using kind of financial technology, doing a lot of online lending on the internet, and the way they're posing themselves as kind of alternatives. And they're posing themselves as alternatives for people who would be considered, quote unquote, invisible and unscorable. These are the words that are used by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a federal agency that is very much tasked with kind of concerns around consumer protections. So you're hearing a lot about them right now regarding kind of trying to stand up against predatory lenders, particularly around like the subprime crisis, as well as payday lenders and so forth, right? So they call credit invisibles those without an NCRA record. And this is a national credit rating agency. So this is Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, right? So there's about 26 million adults who do not have, who are credit invisible. Then there are people who are considered credit unscorable. Oh, I see the difference when you put the mic closer. Okay. Credit unscorables, right? These are people who do have a credit record, but they have insufficient credit history to generate a credit score. And so that could be that they haven't used a certain kind of account right? So you know how, let's say, if you have stayed at the same location for a long time and you haven't opened up a new account, or if you stopped paying on something, right? And so there's about 45 million people that would not be eligible for kind of Jay-Z's answer about the strip club, right? That's a lot of people. And so one thing that's happening is you have this kind of concern among politicians as well as among community advocates about, well, what happens then to these folks who are invisible and unscorable, right? And I just have to pause and say this is some interesting language that's being used, right, when we're thinking about kind of surveillance and tracking, right? And so what's happening is people are saying, okay, you know, credit matters. And it really does in this economy. So things like a mortgage or a loan, right? Being able to rent, issues around jobs. There are some policies where they're trying to not let your credit score be part of your job applications, but that's still kind of in the process, right? So this is something, if we look at this figure, and this comes from a report from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, right, is what we see is this definitely affects non-white people the most, right, particularly Black and Latino people. And so this is something where people are saying, you know, being unscorable or invisible is definitely something that contributes to the racial wealth gap. It's something that affects, obviously, poor and working class people. And we know that poor and working class people is racially diverse. But as far as kind of who's more disproportionately in the poor and working class segments, right? And so the intersection with race and class. This also obviously intersects with gender. Right? If we think about a lot of times the status of women, and part of the history of trying to kind of make credit more available is about women trying to kind of demand more equal protection around kind of access to credit. So that's something like if we think about the Equal Opportunity Credit Act in 1974. A lot of women, particularly including those who are married, and were often being judged through their husbands and the way that their financial status was kind of regulated through marriage, they were at the forefront and kind of pushing some of these demands, as well as people of color. And yes, people of color and women can be one and the same, I know that, but it's hard to slash when you're talking, okay? So the thing is, you know, they were at the forefront of kind of pushing for access, right? So a lot of times access to something gets associated with being kind of racial or gender or class justice issue. And I'm somebody who thinks a lot about what are the alternatives, right, to power and domination. And are those alternatives something that really speaks to kind of expanding freedom, or do they include newer traps, right? And so I'm thinking about the idea of alternative data as a trap. All right. So one thing is, this is from a website, and when you look at alternative data, that's the term that's getting used by a lot of people, including the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, banks, a lot of kind of business websites. So that's the lingo that's being used. And so alternative data would include, and so real quick, like here's the Community Financial Protection Bureau is exploring the impact of this, right? This was from 2017. So they're in the process of kind of, you know, figuring out what are people's thoughts about it, and so forth. Advocates, for example, people who work in law, they're talking about the privacy issues. So when we think about kind of privacy and civil liberties, things like financial surveillance are part of that conversation, right? So this is something that this is currently still floating around. So this hasn't made much movement in Congress, but this is in 2017. This is Senator Tim Scott. He is a Republican from South Carolina. Expanding kind of alternative data options is getting bipartisan support, right? And so one of the things that they talk about here is they talk about the FICO score, right? And FICO has become kind of synonymous with credit score. FICO is the credit score that was established in 1989, so it's still fairly new, by the Fair Isaac Corporation. But it's become kind of the dominant score in a lot of ways, and FICO has done a lot to kind of push itself to be the dominant score. So when you read like fintech companies saying, oh, we're providing an alternative, or when you read news stories like this, they name the FICO score as kind of credit score. They treat it as synonymous, right? And so what you have here is this kind of push also politically, right, for alternative data. Now, one of the things that we want to remember and that, I think is really important about credit scoring is so ubiquitous. It's something that's treated as necessary. And it very much, as I said, it is a lot of times necessary to kind of do any kind of financial activity that we see as meaningful. But it's a business, right? Fair Isaac Corporation is a business. And the FICO score is a business, TransUnion, Experian, and so forth, right? And so one of the things that's been interesting to see is how these companies, including FICO, are responding to the challenges that are being posed to them. And they're, doing this interesting kind of dance, right? They're talking about themselves as being less discriminatory and more scientific. So one of the things I raised in the chapter for Ruha's book is about how, FICO tries to treat itself as less discriminatory than digital lenders. And I introduced this concept called digital character because a lot of these online lenders are tracking your social media, right? So we've heard about how in China they're doing kind of social characteristics and so forth, right? That's happening here. So they're tracking things like your Facebook, your Twitter. They're looking at where you tweet from. Do you have an iPhone, right? Or are you tweeting from a cafe? Does that tell them that you don't really have good phones? All that stuff, right? So they're doing all this kind of data collection. The way Fair Isaac and these companies are responding is they're saying, hold on a second. We're more scientific. We're more unbiased, right? We're not going to do that type of stuff, right? But what you see is different companies like TransUnion and also, as I'll show you, FICO, they're trying to get into the alternative data game, right? Because this is getting, more and more traction politically, and it's building more momentum, right? And so they're saying, well, we can also do alternative data, right? And so here's a new product that TransUnion is promoting, saying, oh, you're saying we're too limited in the scoring that we participate in. We can also expand what we look at, right? Here, for example, is FICO, right? And FICO now wants you to know they have a new score, not just the FICO score, but they have a new score that also takes into account alternative data. So that can include, and this is some of the stuff, if we look here, it probably is hard to see back there, so I'm just going to emphasize some of this. But if we think about the politicians, right, who are talking about kind of alternative data, they're talking about things like maybe your rental payments, your utility payments, your cell phone bills, right? And they're saying, okay, we can include more of that and see if you kind of pay on time to assess risk and the possibility of defaulting, right? Also social network data, right? Social profile data. FICO also wants you to know that they're working with these highly systematic products to do interesting kind of, profiles on you, right? So this is something where they're having this kind of battle, right, in the marketplace over what data to use, but also who's going to remain, quote unquote, more scientific and supposedly less discriminatory, right? And so this is something where they also then know that this conversation around alternative data is a conversation about inequality, right? And particularly about people of color and or working class people, right? And so, as they say in the survey data, that's where they get into this whole thing about like they're working with people to really do some real deep stuff scientifically, right? But all this to say is the major credit scorers in the game are jumping into the alternative data business, right? And to remind us once again that this is a business, right? Now, one of the things is, this is from their website, FICO score myth versus reality, right? And what I'm very interested in is this relationship between policy and narrative, right? And what are the narratives that are being constructed about why are people struggling economically, right? About also choices. So I think this is something that's very interesting with your work, Rose, because part of what you're getting at in a lot of ways were these choices people were making about a lot of things that some of us might want to keep private, but that is something that's being tracked. Their financial decisions, right? And when we think about kind of choose your own adventure, right? We know that it's much more complicated than that. We're choosing our own adventure against the structural realities, right? They're being shaped. So here, one of the things that FICO has been critiqued for is how do you calculate your scores? And they don't tell us all that. They just say, well, these are things that we take into account, right? Your repayment history, your new credit accounts, right? But they have trade secrets because, again, they're a business. So the way they actually calculate these scores are trade secrets for these companies. And yet these scores have so much impact in our lives, right? So these are political issues. They're not allowed to be open to public scrutiny in a certain way, right? And this is what's really deep to me if we think about kind of the choose your own adventure kind of like mythology, right? It says, this data is pulled from your credit report and plugged into the FICO trademark score formula. Your FICO score moves up and down as this data changes. Your precise FICO score at any given moment is a snapshot in time. Because new data is constantly added to your credit report, you alone have the power to improve your score by consistently paying all your bills on time and managing your credit wisely, right? And so the narrative, right, the idea of kind of everything is about personal responsibility, you alone have the power, right? That narrative is so pervasive, right? You know, I teach sociology of race and ethnicity, I teach sociology of the family, and in those courses we think a lot about these discourses around culture and behavior and the way that inequality gets explained, right? And so it's so pervasive, but it's something that they can attach as part of kind of their advertising, and it does a lot of kind of political work, right? And so one of the things, you know, is, as I said about the fintech battle, right, and the fintech kind of lenders battling with kind of the FICO lenders, as I said, you know, they might have conflict in the marketplace, but they're not antagonistic in terms of vision, right? They're still committed to this idea of kind of a scored society. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Frank Pasquale, right? And so he and Daniel Keats-Citron have talked about the scored society, the idea of kind of being scored people. This goes, I think, a lot to your point, right, Dan? And so the way that we're kind of calculated as a score, this is not a totally new thing. But when we think about alternative data, it means more and more and more of our information and our decisions, right? And tough decisions. Things like, do I, you know, pay the light bill, or maybe get, hope that they keep the lights on, and I'll pay my rent instead, right? Or somebody got sick and I have to figure out, do I call an ambulance? Or, you know, when you're talking about the robots, right? Or the quality of care that I can afford, and so do I let something else slide in my bill payment history? And so what this means is the so-called solution, alternative data, is actually just taking more and more of people's activities and decision-making and tough decisions and emotional decisions and stressful and physically demanding decisions, right? And it's saying that this data is going to free you in some ways to get access to something that does have meaning, such as credit, right? And so it means more surveillance, right? It means kind of more of the way that you're kind of blamed, right, for certain decision-making activity, even though you don't set the prices for a lot of things, right? And, you know, the decisions that you're making are based upon structural, you know, dynamics that you don't have total control over, right? And it's being marketed as freedom. And so that's something where that just really, really frustrates me, and it repulses me, frankly. Okay, so I want to end with Adrienne Rich, right, the poet. I'm a big fan of her poetry. And one of the ways that I comfort myself is I read a lot of quotes and passages. And so if we think about people like James Boggs, if we think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Adrienne Rich, a lot of them were talking about technology. And this is something very prominent in James Boggs' work. And they were talking about technology in terms of also our social vision, right? What vision do we actually have that we're trying to implement with the technology? So she asked this question: can a radical social imagination clothe itself in a language worn thin by usage or debased by marketing, promotion, and the will to power? A new century, even a new technology, doesn't of itself produce newness. It is live human beings looking in all directions who will do this. And she wrote this in 2001. And so when I think about how alternatives get marketed, when I think about, all the different technology that's being used and how it's being marketed as justice or equality or freedom or new opportunities, I found this quote very useful for thinking critically through that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Tamara. And I kind of want to just leave this up because it's a really great quote. We have some time for some questions for all of our panelists. I don't know, do you guys want to hang out on a couch up here, or we can bring up some more chairs, or if people have more comments than questions. How are you feeling? I can also just pass the mic around. Whatever works. Does anybody have questions, insights? I'm sorry to put you all on the spot like that. Yeah, let's get the. Oh man, to the rescue. Chairs are complicated. Conferences are extremely. So, do we have any questions, insights? Do you have anything you want to ask one another, or observations? Should I?
Hi, I Henwin with Data and Society. I actually have a question or provocation about the credit. So we call it credit, but it's actually just debt, getting people into debt in order to establish some sense of credit. Mm-hmm. Is it then a good thing?
Do you want to elaborate more by what you mean, please?
Sure. So I guess the part of the reason why it's such a challenge for communities of color is they're subjected to such higher rates of indebtedness as a result of being able to have a credit score. In order to buy a car, they have to pay 20% interest, as opposed to someone who has a good credit score who can get it for 0%. So I just kind of question whether the credit system is even good. And is there given that this is what's happening is people are being asked to give more information about themselves, whether they should participate.
I mean, I think this is part of the challenge, right? What does it mean not to participate? And I think that's part of, this is the beginning of kind of a larger project. And one of the things that I want to do is I'm trying to look at kind of alternative economic models that people are doing. So if we think about here in New York City, like the New Economy Project, doing stuff around public banking. I don't know if you guys know, they kicked off a campaign to do stuff around public banking and challenging also disinvestment from prisons and immigration enforcement and so forth. And or people are, establishing a lot more co-ops, and that's not a new thing per se. So I think the idea of kind of indebtedness and what does it mean to kind of be in debt to somebody, people are also exploring that politically. The difficulty is that as we create these alternative models, you still a lot of times to be able to pay your rent and do different things do have to have a credit score. So it's very difficult not to participate in some way. And I think that's part of the bind that I'm trying to think through and against, right? And I don't have the answer. Part of this, as I said, is a bigger exploration. But I think the fact that you can be punished for both not participating and participating, right, is part of the issue in and of itself, right? Oh, okay.
First of all, thank you so much. It was really great, all of them. My question has to do with government regulation and how it really is a question for each of you in terms of thinking through what your ideal would be, considering to what extent it already is a factor within some of the issues that you were discussing. What would you like to see happen?
I don't want to go first.
Yeah. As a card-carrying historian, I have no relevance to anything ever in the present. But I mean, a point kind of on the last point, but also a way of kind of trying to answer your question is, at one level, it's I feel like the job I'm trying to do is just to denaturalize whatever it seems like the necessary way to think about a problem, and to think about it in a regulatory sense as well, and to realize the power of regulation to change even how we think about these sort of things. Right? The story I was told was in some ways about how creating a new regulatory apparatus then called into being whole new ways of understanding both the factories and the things themselves. So it's an argument against, it's not an argument against thinking about political economy, it's an argument about realizing how much culture there is infused in our political economy, and that we can think about this. So like when we're thinking about the credit score, I would love, Tamara, their story. It felt like it was one of these stories where, well, oh man, this mousetrap's not catching very many mice. Let's build a better mousetrap. But maybe you don't want to catch mice, right? Like it might just be that like all we're doing is creating a much better score, but the score itself is the problem, and it's supporting the system just let the mice run free, man. I mean, mice are wonderful. So I dodged the question.
I'm also going to kind of dodge the question. I think that one thing that I think a lot about as a journalist who gets pitched technologies a lot actually gets to both of your points, which is that there's this sense that humans are machines in a lot of ways, and we need to optimize what we're doing with those machines. And that gets at, when we think about the problem, right? We already call it a problem, the problem of aging people, as if that like isn't a new thing, which is not. Obviously, people have aged for forever. But when we think about like when I get pitches for these technologies, and they're really about optimizing the solution in a way that talks about the body as a machine, and that talks about humans and our relationships to each other as a system in a very like mechanical and like scored way. Obviously like there's an obsession with data, there's an obsession with like quantifying everything, and then there's also the sort of added layer of patronization or patronizing older people as if they are like, even your question where you're like, what does he want? And it's like, it doesn't enter the question often when we talk about what happens to people that are older, right? Where it's like, oh, of course they don't want their own things, like as if they don't have brains and minds that like have desires. And so I think that when we look at the ways that things like senior care facilities are regulated, they often are regulated as if it's like, how do we get the most bang for our buck in the system, as if like we're not talking about humans. And it's like not a very humane way of thinking about it. But at the same time, a lot of the time when you look at regulations within nursing homes, some of those regulations are also not helping, in the sense that it's harder for care workers to like get health insurance. It's hard, like a lot of the systems that they operate in are not designed necessarily for, they're not designed with people thinking like what is best for each individual human, and they're thinking about like the machine system and like how does it work as a system. I don't have a proposal for how to change that kind of, because it's like a million different policies that all kind of like are enmeshed on top of something like a senior care facility that might turn to robots instead of like paying their human workers more. So I don't have a proposal for like your question of like what do you want to have happen, I think is hard to answer.
Well, are we getting to the stage where we need a quantification of the human by the government, right? To say this is the value of a human life.
Oh, they already do that.
I mean, but that's also, sorry. And this kind of goes to Dan's historiography. Today we use the term living wage, and it's used in a very powerful way to talk about the challenge to the minimum wage. But historically, the living wage was a concept by economists that did this quantifying to literally say how much do they have to live on and how much do we really have to pay them. And it was a very conservative measure. So I think that part of, as you were saying, like we're already we've had that, we're still in that. It's just also kind of going back to Dan's point, it's happening in a different way. And it's happening, I think, in a different way that we're actually being encouraged to participate in, and like everything from apps, right, and kind of our scores, and we're kind of using that, and a lot of times we're identifying it. We're actually being encouraged to identify with it, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't think that's actually a new thing per se. But to your question about government regulation, I'm not prepared to answer that question. I'm still thinking through what I would like an alternative vision to be, and part of it's trying to, as I said, study more some of the stuff that's being done on the ground right now regarding community banking, regarding community economies, and the way they're kind of negotiating it. So I'm still learning in that regard.
Now my question feels way too specific, but I would Dan's work, especially those graphs, made me think, well, how would this apply to the kind of gig economy or on-demand economy that we're in right now? Whereas you're saying, like, you know, the drive share services, for example, like people are like being encouraged to like invest a lot into their score. Like I know I'll never give anybody less than a 5 because I have no idea what might happen to them if their score drops too much. So do you see these charts sort of like, I don't know if you're even looking into that because it's like, you know, what's happening right now. So I forgive you if you're not, but I'm just curious if you see that form of measuring like the life of a person's work or quality of it could even apply to how we're thinking of the gig economy.
No, I mean, this part is more speculation at this point, but I think that it's not a coincidence that this idea of creating a service life is first done with kind of big capital goods, and then the next place you see it turn up with things is what you would call death dating, where Sony makes a Walkman and assumes the Walkman's gonna stop functioning in 2 years, so you have to buy a new Sony. Right, and of course, like Apple has engineered this to perfection, but so that was a service life again, and they have lots of statistics figuring out what the service life of these things are. But the point was to make them as short as possible, and I think part of what the gig economy story is a way of having turned this around and decided, well, you know, we were imagining the service life was supposed to be 30 years. What if we say the service life is infinitesimally small now, right? It's the momentary set of transactions. There's clearly a lot more going on than just that one calculation. There's also a weird way in which the pensions are really important and in contradictory ways, right? Much of my story was really just about pensions. Once the pension exists, then you have this long service life and you have a long career. The growth of pension funds, though, of course, produced this short-termism in markets where quarterly reports matter so much, because the people who most can push that we want dividends right now are the giant institutional ventures, which are our pensions, right? So our pensions, the pensions of those people who have had long careers, are in many ways driving the move towards everybody having living on much shorter time periods. I mean, which I guess another way of answering your question earlier would be, I guess, just to say, with Tamara, is why is it that we're making these individual choices, right? I'd rather, I want to get rid of scoring in general most of the time, because it's assuming that I as an individual have a lot more agency than I do, and I'd rather go back to older models of scoring that often have to do with kind of their own inequities, like where you live, but just the idea that you're part of a community, for instance, a national community or a state community or whatever, and that the risks should be borne equitably and equally across that community, regardless of you.
Yeah, I was just wondering how, I mean, maybe it builds on the question about regulation. So in Europe now, there's GDPR, and part of GDPR is about models have to be explained, right? So if I don't know in practice how insurance companies or how credit scoring agencies are doing it, but in theory, as far as I understand, and I don't understand it very well, but they have to be able to explain to you how they came to whatever score, whatever insurance premium. Now, I don't know in practice how they do it. I'm sure they probably just say, oh, it's it's lots of factors. It's because you alone have the power to change it, whatever. But I'd be really interested to know how that approach might, or that kind of explainable system approach might affect this, because I guess if the score is if the method is actually like a trade secret or it's patented, well, I guess if it's patented they have to reveal it, right? So I guess if they keep them as trade secrets. But what would it do if you suddenly did find out that, I don't know, the reason my insurance has gone up is because, I don't know, I regularly visit a particular bar in a particular neighborhood, or the reason that, I don't know, I'm just trying to think, what does that do to people? How would that affect, will there be a whole new category of kind of, systems to disrupt? Once the systems are explained how they work, will people start having, I don't know, developing ways to shield against it, or fake check-ins, or I don't know, what? I'm intrigued by what could happen, but also, I don't know.
Like Yelp, but for how good your score is going to be.
I think what you're raising is an interesting point, because there is this way where, let's see here, one thing that could be demanded by regulators is for these companies to have to reveal their trade secrets, right? But that would be kind of a whole different battle that I really doubt will happen. But it could be interesting, because there is this way where, and this is kind of what Pasquale gets at with the black box, is there's just a lot of ways that they can kind of say, oh, this percentage comes from this, but how we actually calculate it. And also the fact that it changes so rapidly, so it also keeps kind of the credit scoring industry, you know, even though you can get your free credit report, right, and there's different legislation to let you check it once or something for free, there's this way where it keeps the business of it going. And we would need the regulators to say, we need to take on credit scoring as a business, and, which is a different kind of conversation than saying, what other data should credit scoring agencies take into account, right? Which just keeps it going as a business. I would say, and this is, I think, where I might disagree with Dan here, is that, you know, part of, like, even though the alternative data isn't good to use, I would argue against using alternative data in the way it's being used or proposed now. The stuff regarding, you know, this is where I think thinking about the racial politics of segregation, thinking about some of that, and that you also have people being scored, so what neighborhood you come from, and some of these kind of older models of stuff do usually result in kind of higher insurance rates, particularly for Black people, and so forth. And so this is something where, you know, I wouldn't say returning to the past also doesn't address this either, right? And this is something that I think people are kind of also having a debate upon, how to think about issues like character. So part of the bigger conversation I'm thinking about is this issue around how character is developed, because character and the idea of kind of what character people have, you know, as Ingrid, when she introduced me, I do a lot of stuff on immigrant entrepreneurship. And part of that work is trying to challenge this discourse of immigrant so-called character and Asian immigrant character, and how that's often been used to suggest that Asians just are self-sufficient, hardworking people, and that denies a lot of times the political economy and banks and government regulations and so forth that participate in this process. And so this idea of kind of building character is really at the heart of a lot of these kind of models and these scoring models, right? And what is your so-called character? Part of the question becomes, if we reveal how that character is scored, does that relieve us of still trying to meet up to that, right? And will we become even more self-conscious about all of our activities? A lot of us are so extremely self-conscious of all of our decisions. This is a big part of the stress that we bear. I don't know if it will relieve anyone to kind of try to outsmart that either. Do you know what I mean? If that makes sense.
Thank you. There's a pretty interesting project from Germany. It's called Open Schufa. Schufa is like the main credit scoring company in Germany, and an NGO tried to reverse engineer, or is trying to reverse engineer their scoring. So they raised money via crowdfunding, like over 40,000 euros, and then 20,000 people submitted or like donated their scores in order to experiment with them and to like figure out whether they can reverse engineer it. And the first reaction from Schufa was they totally freaked out. So they were really scared that they would eventually like manage to reverse engineer it. So I was wondering if there are similar initiatives or yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure. This is the type of stuff that I want to investigate. So thank you for sharing that, because that would be an interesting model to look at and to kind of see. Part of it's just even trying to get a vocabulary around the alternatives. That's kind of where I'm at right now. So, but thank you so much.
I do think there's something, not on credit scores, but the reverse engineering question of some of these algorithms that like are black boxes. Like ProPublica has done some really great work around some of the like, you know, do you get bail or not? And it's like, if you're black, no. If you're white, yes, even if the crime is the same. And like, so we know some of the things that determine this. It doesn't change the fact that that happens, right? And so I think, you know, somewhat to your question about like, if we just knew, wouldn't that be better? And I don't know that that's necessarily the case, because the things that are creating these systems are not things that we can individually just be like, oh, well, I will just change that thing, that like structural oppression that exists in this world. So the other thing is like, you know, I think it would be very easy for companies to tell, like you were saying, like tell us what's happening in a way that makes it totally unclear what's happening, right? Like terms of service, if you ever read them, you know, like they're telling you something. What are they telling you? And they're designed to be intentionally difficult, right, to read. So I think that it is, I think we all like to think that if we just had more information, then we could make better decisions and we could like do the right thing or change things, but that's not necessarily the case, whether it's credit scores or like bail decisions or whatever it is.
And I think, you know, your example and also the point you're raising about the ProPublica stuff, I think it raises this interesting question about what do we think reverse engineering involves, right? So on one hand, the example you gave that I just learned about a minute ago, so I know that I'm very limited, right? But from what you're saying, it sounds like it's like trying to figure out how to beat them at their formula and to kind of recalculate a new formula, right? But it's still staying within this kind of discourse of scoring. But if we think about a lot of the stuff that's happening with cash money bail, right? Or if we think about, you know, the bailing out black mamas, the bailing out black fathers campaigns, right? That are happening a lot, you know, nationally. Southerners on new ground. If we think about, you know, that's happening in different local cities, there's a way where that to me would also be part of the process of reverse engineering, but it doesn't necessarily kind of, you know, it's not maybe necessarily within kind of the idea of we're going to work within the same exact formula that you have and try to kind of recalculate or recalibrate the formula in that way. But it is a form of trying to reverse engineer how we kind of manage, right, populations and so forth. And so I think it's also about looking at models of kind of reverse engineering you're talking about, but also not getting totally kind of limiting us to our vision of reverse engineering, requiring us to only kind of do this nitty-gritty kind of data stuff, right? Either. That's part of it, but there's also all this organizing that's, you know, confronting these things that is also part of that reverse engineering that wouldn't necessarily kind of be doing some of that same work.
I think we're at time. I want to say thank you to all of our wonderful panelists again.